Good morning. So we're going to do a quick introduction of Steve. I'm sure you all have read about him, but we've written some stuff down. So Steve Sieck is a Unitarian Universalist minister dedicated to building communities of compassion, justice, and mutual thriving. Steve was a choral director for 25 years, teaching most recently at Lawrence University Conservatory of Music in Wisconsin from 2010 to 2024. Steve's research focused on how to help music educators develop inclusive teaching strategies. Steve studied ministry at the Beadville Lombard Theological School and completed his ministerial internship at First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee. In his clinical pastoral experience, he supported residents at homeless shelters. Steve and his wife are licensed foster parents who have cared for 9 children with significant trauma. This journey was essential to his call to ministry. Steve is an avid runner and reader who loves the storytelling of stand-up comedy and podcasts. His spiritual practices include sitting meditation, journaling, and hikes. Steve shares the journey with his wife, Ann, a special education birth to 3 specialist, and their 5 children, ages 4 to 22. We'll do a quick chalice lighting. Do you want to light the chalice for us, Becky?
The lighters should be forward.
Thank you. Got it? This is The End is the Beginning by Katie Gelfand. We call forth the life of our faith by igniting the chalice. The spark of new beginnings invites us into a sacred space to reflect where we have been and where we are going. Even knowing that in this particular flame, we will intentionally end with our ritual extinguishing, we fear not its end. For we know that with brave hearts, that from the ending of our lives, from every ending of our lives, we are sent forth to make a new beginning.
I noticed that you have in front of you, or you've been given a copy of Steve's background, and you'll notice in there that he has written a book. James Baldwin has this to say about writing. The terrible thing about being a writer is that you don't decide to be one. You discover that you are one. Ministry is very much the same. Steve did not decide to be a minister. He discovered that he was one. And we are very pleased to have Steve here with us. We have the opportunity now to benefit from that, and we from the Ministerial Search Committee are glad that he answered our search.
So 2 things about me. I love pizza, and I despise fascism. My first introduction to Steve was a sermon titled Pizza and Fascism. I would highly recommend Googling up that sermon.
He is such a good listener. He holds himself to a high standard. I respect him so much. His ethics are impeccable. Steve is a minister. He is creative, smart, and artistic. So these are all quotes that were heard from the reference calls that we had during our due diligence in the search. I had finished every call when we followed up about Steve, feeling that my impressions were being backed 100% by the people that he has worked with, the people that know him well. But what I personally like best about Steve is the sincerity that I felt from the answers when we were peppering him with questions, and in that sincerity when he talked about trust and how he has the intention of building trust with us, with each of us individually, as a congregation, and then outside our walls and into the larger community. So I really look forward to being part of that and having a ministry built upon trust, because he has done that. It was found with everyone that he has worked with, and now we are lucky that we're going to be benefiting from that as well.
I think Eileen is.
So the very first question, our very first glimpse of Steve was through his ministerial record, as it was with all the candidates. And the very first question on that questionnaire was about telling a story about what his ministry was about. His small question, right? So he told a story about a student of his, a Black queer student, who had came to him and said that they did not feel like the music that they were doing and the way that they were approaching their music was inclusive, and went on to say that white European music was held in reverence, and African-based music was treated as an exotic other. And Steve's story went on to tell about how he dealt with that situation, and he may tell you that story one day, but I think the thing that impressed me the most about it was just his ability to immediately step back and really check his privilege, and had the humility and the presence of mind to step forward and talk to that student respectfully and take action. So that was my first big thumbs up for Steve.
When you meet someone and receive the gift of deep conversations, it may show you who they are and rarely who they are becoming. Our time with Steve kept bringing me back to two quotes. The first is a Quaker saying, "Let your life speak." Steve's life, both professionally and personally, speaks directly to our UU principles and values. On his becoming, I kept thinking of Dag Hammarskjöld, the first UN Secretary General, who reflected on his aspiration: "If only I may grow, firmer, simpler, quieter, warmer." As you come to know Steve, you will see a man who is still growing, with both humility and wonder. We would be a fortunate congregation indeed to speak proudly of our UU values with Steve, and to grow our congregation with such a minister.
In the congregational survey, in our search parties, in our conversations with you, the essence of what I heard over and over again is that you wanted someone with a true heart for community, fostering a caring community and building a beloved community, both within these walls and beyond them. In Steve, I saw someone who spoke of and demonstrated that kind of heart, of being transformed by caring for children with trauma backgrounds, of sitting in the discomfort with people as they go through change, of providing sustained parenting support to overwhelmed families, and prioritizing relational connections. A minister cannot be the person who shows up and fixes everyone. We know that, and Steve noted it as well. But they can be someone to accompany us and help guide us all on the journey of expanding the loving kindness of this community.
Now it's your turn. So, one more. We will now take questions here. Please state your name and your question briefly. And keep your mouth close to the mic. Yes.
I have two questions. The first is a little frivolous. Do you prefer Chicago-style, Mediterranean, or vegetarian pizza?
That's not frivolous, and yes is the answer. But when I visit my family in Chicago, yeah, we go immediately to Eduardo's or Giordano's.
Okay. The second one is, why are you interested in moving to Des Moines other than the lovely running path right next to the church, Waterworks Park, which is bigger than the Central Park in New York, and the lovely people.
That seems like a leading. My wife and I had to be very particular about where we could answer a call. And so on the one hand, we needed a place that was livable, a place where the school district would understand our children as complex and not as anything other than that. We needed a city that had a size where we could make our way through it. We lived in Chicago, we lived in Los Angeles, we lived in Appalachia in a community where there was, you got your mail from the post office and there was no stop sign. So we've seen it all. And we realized in midlife that the Appleton kind of energy, we live in Appleton, Wisconsin currently, is the right energy for us. It's the right it's right-sized for our needs. And when I visited Des Moines, I called my wife after the first day and said, it's like if Appleton just got bigger, right? And so that's part of it. But the other part about why Des Moines, there is, in this moment that we're living in, and I think it's going to be a pretty long one, there is a specific role for ministers in this body that ministers not in this body cannot serve. And so the question was, is this state, is this region sort of hopelessly in one direction or another, right? And it's not, right? In fact, pending that lawsuit, the register kind of thought that the election was going to go a different way. So I think this is a community where our work together actually has direct impact. I was looking for a capital city where that public witness would be of importance, right? And not just screaming into the wind, but like actually building relationships, getting a cup of coffee with state assembly members, regardless of which side of the aisle they sit. So this is a right-sized community where we can make, as a community here, an actual difference. And you're already doing that. I don't mean to say like, you're doing nothing, but all of that went into the factor. And so truth be told, from the moment this search was listed last fall, my wife and I just circled that one and said, that's the one.
We have a lot of wonderful pizza places.
Everybody says that, but after Chicago, yeah.
I'll be right there.
Oh, okay, I split the room on pizza, sorry.
So good morning, Steve. Still morning, isn't it? Mike Andreski and Kara Andreski. My family is a non-birth UU family, and we had an interesting journey to UU. Could you tell us about your journey from your faith beginnings and into UU?
Yeah, happily. I grew up in a very social justice-oriented liberal Catholic parish. We had a station wagon that had the "If you want peace, work for justice" bumper sticker. My mom gave homilies at that church before the new bishop came in. And so this idea in my first theological experience that you are meant to be the hands of Christ in the world was formational, right? My parents had gone through their Catholic educations at the height of Vatican II. So this idea that God favors the oppressed and works against injustice was foundational in our family. The prayer of St. Francis sat directly over my head in the kitchen, and it continues to, metaphorically, right? And so that was our experience. We were in all other respects a very humanist family. My father, interestingly, had gone to seminary for priesthood and was like, nope, and and hard noped out of it. And so I understood church and community to be showing up in the world, loving one another, feeding the hungry, but theology we never talked about. By about 14, when I was going through confirmation, and you do start talking about theology, I was that 14-year-old that said, but what about, which I'm guessing is many of you. And you poke enough and they say, do you want to do this? And I say, no. And they say, okay, great, you don't have to. So I spent a long period of time in that sort of shoulder-shrugging agnosticism of, by 18, I was working in church music. And church music is a really great ecumenical journey, right? So in the university chapel, it was a UCC minister. And then when I graduated and I worked in Catholic churches and Jewish synagogues, and then I worked with Lutherans and Methodists and Presbyterians. I never did Baptists. But I got this sort of tour of the ways that other people in different traditions tease out meaning from the same texts. And it was always deeply meaningful to me. Grad school in music, I was hired as the music director at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Urbana, Illinois. And that was, I think we were in our late 20s. And for my wife and I, who grew up very liberal Episcopalian, we walked out of the first service and going, this is our people. I think one of us made the joke that we weren't air quoting anymore, right? There was, but it was so big. And I remember, I didn't know, this is a part of our denomination. You don't know it exists until it exists, right? And we're sometimes a little shy to tell a friend, you should come with me. I think you'd like it. And they go, oh, I don't do church. And you're like, that's not really what we do either. Like, you should come. So it was this well-kept secret until we found it, and it was so beautiful. Now, life brought us into other, like in that part of Appalachia where there just wasn't a UU church down the road. But there was always this commitment, this is where we need to be. And so I became, the day we moved into Appleton, Wisconsin, was a Saturday, and that Sunday, we all walked into the Appleton church, signed the membership book, and that's where we were. Yeah. We could talk about theology for 5-6 hours. How much time do we have? But that's the short answer there. Thank you.
Yes, yeah, I have a few questions for you. My name is Michael Lewis. Do you believe in universal salvation?
Do I believe in universal salvation?
Yeah, the universalist aspect.
Yeah.
You do?
I don't know how to answer that without taking 5 hours. I accept the universalist claim that all are children of the divine, however that sentence means. I don't, for my personal theology, again, I don't know how many hours we have, I'm less interested in what happens after I die. I think I'm probably dead when I die. But if there is such a thing as the soul's restoration with Brahman, Allah, the ground of being, then I do believe that everyone is saved. I've talked with another Unitarian Universalist minister who said, yeah, but I hope not everyone goes immediately. And that wasn't but I understood her perspective, right? That's the ultra-restorationist, is that the moment your heart stops, you're with the Lord, right? But the universalist claim, the Schillen Quinn, the Hosea Ballou, that history is at the core of everything we've just been talking about, with the commitment to seeing the worth and dignity and love and spark of Brahman in the eyes of everyone, including people I really don't like.
What form of meditation do you practice, your sitting meditation?
Mostly I'm just trying to notice the monkeys in my head. The most compelling thing for me in this moment right now is to sit with the metta, the loving kindness prayer, and I will just work through. It's easy to do with the people you love. You know, may Elaine be filled with loving kindness. May Elaine be well. May she be peaceful and at ease. May she be whole. And then I have to do it with people that I sort of work with but don't have much of an opinion about. And then by the end of that session, if I can get to someone who's really on my nerves, whether they're in the international news or just on the street, because I think our compassion muscles are all a little bit pulled right now. And so that metta prayer for me is deeply important. I try and shake it up, though. I sit with a Sangha, so there's often a prompt.
Thank you for joining us this morning, and perhaps we hope for the future. My name is David Whitkey, and I have a slightly different type of question for you. A few years ago, our church had reached a size where we no longer felt comfortable or efficient using our pure congregational representative form of government. and we adopted a form of governance called policy governance. We have modified that somewhat in the intervening years. But as you probably know, this requires our minister to have a rather bifurcated assignment. Our minister here is not only our pastor, but also our chief executive and chief administrator. Looking at your notes, you have a wonderful background in the pastoring side. I'm wondering, what is your experience about executive management? And maybe beyond what is your experience, to what is your philosophy of executive management?
Yeah, thank you. And I want to, if we end up with time, I want to come back to the policy governance piece of it. I had the pleasure of first serving as treasurer and then president for 6 years for the Wisconsin Choral Directors Association. It's a nonprofit that serves all of the state's choir directors, so hundreds of members. And in that role, I managed the board, managed the major events, managed the recruitment, hired and fired staff, right? All of those pieces. I was the president when we hit the pandemic, and one thing you really can't do in a respiratory virus pandemic is have choir, right? And so navigating how to advocate that all of these choral teachers don't get immediately fired in a state that had lost its collective bargaining for teachers, but that also supporting teachers with how to pivot to curricula that are relevant and helpful to building all the other skills that you can't do because we have a concert next week. So leading that organization in its good times and in its disaster times was really an important part of that for me. To the policy governance part, so this is, and I think the search committee discovered this, I love to talk about governmental policies. So I'll slow it down a little bit, but just to say that there is, in pure policy governance, the board does this and they set the ends, and then the minister does this and they do the means, and then we do reports on the ends, and it is a system that is really beautiful for extremely large congregations, right? It comes, in many ways, you see it out of Unity in St. Paul, for example, with Rob and Jan Eller-Isaacs of blessed memory. And my internship minister supervisor came from that school, and she runs policy-based governance in Milwaukee. So I've studied with her on that. What most congregations of our size do is a sort of Hotchkiss model, which is a little bit more blended in its purposes there. The nice thing about any of those forms of governance is that it clarifies what is and isn't your role. And so we talked about a little bit just in one of the introductions, and we can talk about continually, is that the minister is not in charge of the church, right? It would be satisfying, it would fill some sort of hero need in the minister to put the congregation on its back and climb it up the mountain, right? But that's not good ministry, and you burn out, and then you get mean to your congregants or inappropriate or whatever. But when you hike the congregation up the mountain all by yourself, people don't have their voice anymore. We're not that kind of a congregation. We're not that kind of a denomination. So the shared ministry in the Hotchkiss model, right? The board serves the mission of the church through all of its organizational policies, and then the minister serves the mission of the church through the worship and the staff piece, and they overlap in the lived experience of all of us on a Sunday or a Wednesday, right? And so those conversations are always ongoing, and you find something that fits and then you modify it, right? The pure policy-based governance almost inevitably gets modified because we need something specific to this group here. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, it's actually a good follow-up. It's not quite Kennedy-esque, but if you were the minister that's chosen for us, how do we best set yourself and all of us up for success?
How do we set one another up for success? Yeah. That's a great question, Scott. And I want to answer that attached to a different question that I've already been asked several times. What do you want to fix about us? Have you ever entered a relationship with someone wanting to fix them, and it went well? I've been married 25 years, and I think it's because we agreed at that early part in our lives that we were not going to do a project on one another. We were going to hike together. Have we changed? Yes. Did she know 25 years ago that this was what I was going to look like? You know. But we have grown and changed over those years together. But it was never to fix one another. That's not love. That's control. It is even domination. Yeah. To say, well, I don't need to say more about that. It's a tender subject for many. So, Scott, what I need in the next year or two as a first goal is to know you, right? I know your dog's name's Chachi, but I know one dog. And there are so many dogs, okay? But I don't know what keeps you up at night. I took a guess this morning. I don't know your deepest aspirations for this and for this, right? And you don't know me, and you don't know me enough to say I can trust you to share that with you yet, right? But as we get to know one another in this first year or two, then we can do anything when we have that foundational respect and trust for one another. Doesn't mean agreement. If you agree with every sermon of mine, right, then you're not doing Unitarian Universalism right, okay? Because you're going to have your own thoughts and opinions, and I need those thoughts and opinions to hold, right? Part of the pastoral process is holding the cares, joys, concerns of those in the congregation before you write the sermon. So these two sermons here are the hardest to write because I don't know what's on your hearts. I'm making guesses. So how can we support one another, get to know one another, right? Show me where you're stuck. Show me where you're thriving. And how can I support in that? And then I do have some ministerial role to say, let's push on this a little bit.
Thank you for coming. My name is Diane. I just have two questions for you. Who are your favorite comedians? And two, could you tell us a little bit more about your plans or ideas to make sure that Black, Indigenous, people of color are included in a white dominant church, and how you've done that in the past? It's interesting to hear that you've written a book about inclusivity, and so I'm excited to hear more.
Yeah. Thank you for both of those questions. Favorite comedians. I'm particularly intrigued by the Mike Birbiglia, Hannah Gadsby storytelling structure. And Mike Birbiglia has a podcast where they go into the nuts and bolts of that. And I just nerd out on that. I have a lot of long drives. And also just because Mike Birbiglia and John Mulaney and I are all of a generation and a denominational experience where I feel like I'm Mike's older brother. Your second question is a very big and very deep question. The Unitarian Universalist Association has done, we could fill this room with all the books and conversations that have been had in really the last 10 years about that. I want to say this directed at no one in particular, but as a broad observation. Based on a couple conversations I had with some beloved UU congregants a couple of years ago. Wanting diversity without changing anything about how we do things is wanting other people to join your party and say, I need you to change what you're doing, what you like, what you value, and assimilate into my party. And pluralism's commitment is a potluck. It's a potluck where we share different kinds of experiences. And so, and this is the conversation that comes to my heart with this particular congregant, she didn't want to change anything about when we meet, how we meet, what we sing, what we say, what we don't say, the jokes we make, all of those things. She didn't want to change any of that. She just wanted other people from different experiences to appreciate that with her. I think she wanted the badge that said, look, we are now like the United Colors of Benetton, right? And I understand that that's better than racism, right? That's better than I don't want anyone else in this room. But one of the things that Unitarian Universalists need to sit with is, what are we comfortable making fun of? What are we comfortable saying, that's not what we do here? What are we comfortable singing? Right? And those conversations, you can hear the stillness in the room, right? Everyone stops moving when we get there. So it's an enormous conversation, but I think the first task for a congregation that feels like we are not meeting that need is, one, do people in other communities, are they trying to be here and feel unmet? Or are they thriving in another community? Right, that's one of the things that I talked with this particular member about, was she was saying, oh, I wish this friend would come here. But he goes to his black church. And I was going, do you know the history of black church in America? Do you know the role that that plays? Right? And the strength of that particular community, and why would your friend come here for Mary Oliver, right? So, and so that was a particular challenge, right? I wish I would make $1 billion if I could say in 4 paragraphs, do this, this, this. I frustrated the entire choral education community by saying, you actually need to do more work if you're going to do music from other cultures. Because when you phone in and this is a song from Laotia, like if you phone that in, everyone in your community who comes from that background feels worse off from that than if you had just done Bach, right? So that particular commitment to doing more is hard. I gotta stop there. I could go for 5 hours. Okay. That and theology. Yeah. And pizza. And pizza.
I understand that music's been a big part of your life, and it must be a challenge to move from music to theology. Are you going to miss that?
I appreciate that. That's a beautiful question. I'm still listening to music. I'm still making music. If we're being honest, I think the last 5 years or so of being a choir director were more ministry than music. Certainly when the pandemic started, right? I was just holding space and compassionate care for my students on Zoom. And even when we got back into in-person, I couldn't go back to the most important thing in my day is the tuning of this chord. I couldn't put that back in the bottle. And I'm not saying that is the primary motivation for any choir director, but it was for me. I still listen to music. I'm finding I'm listening to a lot more music now my Spotify has no idea who I am anymore. Because it used to be like, oh, you probably like French Baroque music, but now it's going, what is Kirk Franklin doing in this mix, right? It's a much more eclectic experience now, which is really how it started for me. And, truth be told, I was never both feet in music. I didn't go to a conservatory for undergraduate. I went to the University of Chicago, where they very famously never gave you any credit for any performance. I got a whole degree in how to write about music. But even then, even as a 21-year-old, my senior thesis was on Bach's the Pietist Lutheran theology in the St. John Passion. I was always as much interested in who the person was and what they were making meaning of the world in. So even my dissertation on Benjamin Britten was not really about the work that I was writing about. It was on Britten as a college student trying to figure out his identities.
And I want to know what podcasts you listen to and what would you recommend?
On the Brain, or Hidden Brain? Is it Hidden Brain? Yeah. Every week I'm like, well, that's a sermon right there, right? I don't want to use the word obsessed. I am oriented to the idea that our brains are an organ of perception. They are not accurate computers. I wish they were, they are not. They are organs of perception, and my brain is different than your brain. So the idea that cilantro tastes like soap to me and tastes like a delicious herb to you is just an allele, right? That fires one way versus another, or not fires, but is marked one way versus. And so that is part of this sort of humanist curiosity for the world. So I love getting to know what's it like in your head? What's it like in your head? So On the Brain is one of my favorites. When I'm on a long car trip, I don't want to recommend this to everyone. It's a very specific energy that most of you won't like. But there is a long-form comedy improv podcast called Comedy Bang Bang. And there's probably 3 people that know it, right? And I can drive for hours and listen to it because they're just yes-anding their way through an hour and a half at a time, and then making callbacks to jokes they made 3 years ago. You get it, right? And so on long rides, I can listen and laugh. One of the most important spiritual practices is to laugh, right? So I love that one. I love Hidden Brain. I just discovered a Jack Kornfield podcast. Yeah, and 40 minutes of that, and you're back to your center. Yeah.
Heidi Lockman. Steve, I think you told us how you were both feet in the Appleton congregation as a congregant, but what made your launch into the ministerial journey?
Oh, yeah. Who was I having dinner with last night? I said, I'm going to tell everyone this story 5 times, right? There are 2 ways to tell this story. The short and compelling one. I went to bed a choir director a couple years ago, and I woke up in the middle of the night, just startled awake, going, "Oh my God, I'm a minister!" Like it was like a bolt, right? And I vibrated in bed for like 5 hours, and all of it, it felt like I downloaded 1,000 files, right? I could see all of it. And I just waited, and then my wife woke up eventually, right? Probably from me shaking in the bed. And I said, "Okay, quick conversation. What if I told you I'm a minister?" And she said, "Yes, that's what you are." And I was like, that doesn't help. Because I want to clarify, I was tenured. We had a good thing going, right? I was writing books, I was doing festivals. It was everything I'd worked to achieve in music. And I thought, well, that didn't work. So I called my mother, and I said, "Mom, what if I told you that I'm a minister?" And she said, "Oh, honey, I've known that for..." and on the conversation went with all these people. So that points to the other way to tell the story. The pull to ministry was lifelong. I don't know that other 8th graders were VHS recording Zeffirelli's Jesus of Nazareth, but I was. I don't know that other 15-year-olds were reading Deepak Chopra, but I definitely was. So there's always this pull toward what are we doing here? What is it like? How do we make sense of this world in an honest and sincere way? My wife swears that we had a conversation in our 20s where I said, I want to be a minister. And she said, well, let me ask you, would you rather be the choir director at a congregation with a bad minister or the minister at a congregation with a bad choir director? And apparently I said, oh, I'd rather be the choir director. And so the journey went that way. And here I get to be the minister with a good choir director. So problem solved. But this pull, right? It was never both feet in. This pull toward ministry was a slow burn that accelerated very quickly with fostering. There are many, many ways to be an outstanding music teacher that builds community and love and puts support and joy and compassion into the work. For me, I was sitting there with the Brahms Requiem, which I'd always wanted to conduct, and there I am conducting it. And all I could think about was the social workers and prescription refills and addiction and neglect and all of these things that said, someone else can do that. This is what you need to do. right? So the January night did feel very much like a startling epiphany. And there was a lot of pulling over the years. When I told my students, right, I'm too young to retire, but I'm leaving this position, you're gonna get a new director. And they said, oh, tell me why. And I said, I'm moving into ministry. They're like, yeah, we get it. And I've never regretted that decision. I can still, Appleton had an interfaith Good Friday that needed a choir director, and I hopped right in, and I thought, oh, I still remember. Okay, but this poll, there's a lot of things I lose sleep over, and this role is not one of them. Yeah.
Hi, Anna Davis Evans. I know that we as UUers do so much in the community, and our spirituality is so nuanced, and our spiritual practices are. That said, for me, I know the sermon on Sunday is where I reawaken my roots and prepare to launch into those other aspects. So can you speak a little bit about your process in building a sermon and what your aim is when you're up there doing the preaching part of your role?
Yeah, thank you for that. When I started ministry, I thought it was, what is the smart thing I need to say to people? And that lasted a couple sermons, right? And there's a couple reasons. One, at some point it feels pedantic. And the other, you don't have that many smart things to say. So 35 Sundays a year, you're like, yeah, you already told us that, right? I'm very blessed to be at Milwaukee, where the ministers meet with the celebrant team every month and say, all right, next month we're talking about compassion. What is compassion? And everyone just starts talking, right? And someone's trying to keep notes of the conversation. And you make this giant list at the end of all the things we talked about whatever the topic for next month is. And then the minister goes, okay. And she pulls and goes, so this is, I feel like we're talking about 4 things. Compassion as a practice, compassion as in the world, compassion as internal, right? And she'll pull out our conversation into 4 threads and say, so let's do this one on Sunday the 4th, this one on Sunday the 11th, right? And it becomes, from its onset, a sermon that we brainstormed. Not all 300 members. We're not going to call a forum every month and say, what do you guys want to talk about next month, right? But the celebrants as people in the community. So that's one form of it, is the topic is us generated versus, here's another smart thing I thought about, which gets old pretty quickly. Having been a church musician for a while, right? You're like, you already said that. The second part of it is that when you sit down to write, you are writing with a host of people over your shoulder. There's a spiritual practice of meditating on all the prayers and the hopes and joys that we just lit candles for, and going, how in this service can I give honor to who we lost this week? How in this service, in this sermon, do I speak to, we can't always work in Frisbee golf in the sermon, but if we could, right? So we hold those thoughts with us. The great, great preacher Barbara Brown Taylor writes, there's 3 legs on the stool of a sermon. There's your thoughts, there's the text itself, right? Because you're also trying to wrestle with something. And then there's spirit. And spirit, I think, here translates to us, what's on our hearts. That we can get into the nerdiness of the homiletic, right? So this was a kind of a sermon where we're holding 2 things and then seeing if they can meet at the end. Yeah.
We have many more opportunities to meet and interact, but we're going to have to call this to an end. Okay. We have another session coming up. And, okay.
Thank you all.